In the last decade, talk about the gold standard has shifted from fringe economic circles back to mainstream political debate, and nowhere is that more evident than in discussions surrounding Donald Trump's 2024 presidential ambitions. The concept seems almost fantastical. After half a century of floating currencies and endless central bank interventions, could the United States, under Trump's leadership, seriously try to restore the gold standard? A system where paper money regains its direct link to physical gold. To understand the scope and plausibility of such a secret reset plan envisioned before 2027, it's essential to break down what the gold standard represents, why it disappeared, how it could theoretically return, and what forces, economic, political, and global, might shape this journey. The gold standard was once the cornerstone of world finance. For over 100 years, most major economies fixed their currencies to a specific amount of gold, promising to exchange notes for the real metal. This created stability but also limited government flexibility during crises. After World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement established a gold-backed dollar at $35 per ounce, and all other currencies indirectly relied on America's gold reserves. However, by the early 1970s, persistent inflation, escalating government spending, and widespread redemption of dollars for gold by foreign governments forced President Nixon to sever the dollar's gold link, a dramatic decision known as closing the gold window. A new era of fiat currencies, where money's value is simply declared by governments, began. Today's world looks nothing like that mid-century consensus. Central banks issue money at will, debts have swelled to record highs, and faith in the global system occasionally wavers. A growing chorus of politicians and commentators argue that this paradigm fosters inequality, erodes savings, and leaves economies vulnerable to crises. Donald Trump has at times echoed these frustrations, hinting that the current Federal Reserve regime may not always serve America First interests. In closed-door strategy sessions, his advisors and some allies in Congress have mulled dramatic monetary reforms to create a system where dollars again represent real, tangible value. But why would Trump want to restore the gold standard? And what would that actually change? First, it's important to grasp the motivations behind the idea. The gold standard, in theory, reins in excessive government spending and inflation because a currency fixed to gold cannot be printed freely. Supporters believe it could provide long-term stability, curb deficits, and restore America's global trust, especially if the world faces another crisis that shakes faith in the dollar's value. Such arguments become especially relevant when considering the rise of new competitors like China, which has stockpiled gold, promoted the yuan in global finance, and openly challenged the West's financial dominance. There's also the reality that cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin above all, have popularized the notion of hard money immune to political manipulation, sparking renewed curiosity in gold as a timeless standard. However, moving from philosophical debates to concrete policy is another matter. Trump's hypothetical reset plan would first require surmounting immense political opposition. Congress would need to authorize a new gold peg, a feat complicated by entrenched interests, powerful lobbies, and likely skepticism from most economists. The process would start with a comprehensive audit of America's gold reserves, still held in theory at Fort Knox and other vaults, albeit rarely independently verified. Transparency would be crucial, as trust in the system depends on confidence that the physical gold genuinely backs a new dollar. The next step would involve revaluing gold to a realistic market price. Given decades of inflation and global economic growth, tying every outstanding dollar to gold at the old $35 per ounce rate is impossible. Instead, planners would calculate a new exchange ratio, possibly thousands of dollars per ounce, to cover the monetary base. Such a dramatic shift would immediately affect global finance. For ordinary Americans, a gold standard would mean that dollars could genuinely purchase a set amount of gold, restoring a physical anchor to daily transactions. Inflation would likely drop, at least initially, as the money supply became tethered to gold inflows. For the government, deficit spending would face new restraints, since printing money without new gold reserves would be mostly off the table. Internationally, the move could trigger copycat strategies among rivals or even force allies to make rapid adjustments. The dollar, long the world's reserve currency, might regain trust but also face speculative attacks if faith in America's gold reserves or political system falters. Gold prices would likely surge during the transition, creating fortune and chaos for investors. Existing debts, both public and private, might see their real value shift overnight as the purchasing power of dollars transforms. Deep disruption would ripple through everything from mortgage markets to the cost of imports and exports. Geopolitically, America would dramatically reassert itself as a reliable anchor in global commerce, especially if other economies still struggle with inflation or instability. Trump's advisors, particularly those skeptical of the Federal Reserve, see a gold-backed dollar as a bulwark against perceived manipulations by foreign central banks, especially China's. They argue that this reset would diminish the risk of a currency war, in which nations devalue their money to gain export advantages, a recurring problem since the 2010s. However, risks abound. Critics warn that a gold standard can increase economic volatility as the money supply would be at the mercy of gold mining and international flows rather than domestic needs. The US would lose much of its policy agility in responding to unemployment or crises. Tools that today's Federal Reserve uses to dampen recessions could be blunted or useless. Allies might balk at a unilateral move, especially if it triggers market panic or competitive devaluations abroad. History also shows that countries abandoning the gold standard during past depressions often recovered faster than those who clung to it, leaving economists divided over its modern relevance. Still, proponents believe that only a radical step, like the gold standard, can stop what they see as a cycle of monetary boom, bust, and erosion of real wealth. In this vision, Trump's secret reset plan becomes both a symbolic and practical restoration of control. A bid to lock value into hard, indestructible metal and force the world to adjust to a new economic era led by Washington's rules. The hypothetical plan would require both tremendous political will and technocratic skill. Realistically, it would likely be a phased process, blending gold-backed digital currencies, selective gold convertibility, and gradual de-dollarization of global trade. Rather than an overnight switch, the return might start with government bond issuance tied to gold or a parallel digital hard dollar for international settlements. These incremental steps, already quietly debated in some corners of Wall Street, could lay the groundwork for a wider transition if markets and allies respond positively. To truly appreciate the scale of what such a monetary reset would entail, consider the mechanics of modern money creation and how thoroughly they would need transformation. When the Federal Reserve wants to inject liquidity into the economy today, it simply credits bank accounts electronically, expanding the monetary base with keystrokes rather than mining expeditions. This system, born from the abandonment of gold constraints, allows rapid responses to financial crises like the 2008 collapse or the pandemic recession, when trillions of dollars flooded markets to prevent total collapse. Under a restored gold standard, such flexibility vanishes because every new dollar must correspond to actual metal reserves, turning monetary policy into a zero-sum game where expanding the money supply requires either mining more gold, purchasing it from other nations, or attracting gold inflows through trade surpluses. The implications extend far beyond central banking into the daily lives of millions who rarely think about monetary systems but would feel the effects immediately. Imagine a middle-class family in Ohio with a 30-year mortgage taken out under the old fiat system, suddenly finding that their debt, denominated in dollars, now represents a fixed claim on gold rather than a government promise subject to inflation erosion. If the new gold-backed dollar appreciates in real terms, meaning its purchasing power increases as the money supply stops expanding, that family's debt burden effectively grows heavier even as the nominal amount stays the same, a phenomenon known as debt deflation that devastated farmers and homeowners during the Great Depression when gold standard rigidity prevented monetary expansion. Conversely, savers who watch their purchasing power melt away under decades of inflation might finally see their nest eggs retain value, rewarding thrift and long-term planning in ways the current system discourages. The shift would create winners and losers on a massive scale, potentially redrawing the economic map of America as creditors gain and debtors suffer, or as those holding physical assets adjust to a world where paper wealth means something fundamentally different. This redistributive aspect explains much of the political intensity surrounding the debate, as various interest groups recognize that the rules governing money determine who prospers and who struggles in ways that transcend partisan labels or traditional left-right divides. Internationally, the ramifications would be even more dramatic because the dollar's role as global reserve currency, a status it has enjoyed since Bretton Woods, rests on network effects and accumulated trust that a gold standard could either reinforce or shatter depending on execution. Foreign governments currently hold trillions in dollar-denominated assets, from treasury bonds to currency reserves, all based on the implicit understanding that the US will manage its currency with some degree of responsibility, even without gold backing. If Trump were to announce a return to gold, those governments would face an immediate choice: convert their dollar holdings to the new gold-backed version at whatever rate is set, potentially taking losses if they judge the peg unsustainable, or dump dollars preemptively, triggering the very crisis the reset aimed to prevent. China, sitting on over $1 trillion in US debt and having steadily accumulated gold reserves for years, would find itself in a particularly powerful position, able to demand gold redemptions that could test American reserves or negotiate special arrangements that undermine the system's universality. Russia, already heavily invested in gold and advocating for alternatives to dollar dominance, might see the reset as validation of its strategy or as an opportunity to offer competing gold-backed rubles in regions like Central Asia and the Middle East, where dollar skepticism runs high. European allies, many of whom remember the constraints of the old system and have built their welfare states on flexible monetary policy, would likely resist coordinating their currencies with a new American gold standard, potentially fragmenting the Western financial bloc at precisely the moment when unity matters most against rising powers. The reset could thus accelerate trends toward currency regionalization, with competing gold-backed and fiat systems coexisting uneasily, or it could paradoxically strengthen dollar hegemony if executed perfectly, and other nations lack the gold reserves to offer credible alternatives. The outcome would depend heavily on timing, global economic conditions, and the credibility Trump and his team could muster in convincing the world that America's gold vaults contain what they claim, and that the political commitment to maintaining convertibility will outlast his administration. The technical challenges alone would test even the most sophisticated financial engineers and policymakers. Setting the initial conversion rate, the moment when fiat dollars transform into gold-backed ones, requires solving an equation with multiple unknowable variables. The true size of the monetary base, the amount of gold actually available and reliably in US possession, and the desired level of convertibility, meaning whether every dollar can be redeemed for gold or only certain categories like international settlements. If planners set the rate too low, valuing gold at say $5,000 per ounce when covering the entire M2 money supply requires $10,000, the system would face immediate redemption runs as holders rush to extract undervalued gold, depleting reserves and forcing abandonment within months. If they set it too high, overvaluing the dollar relative to gold, foreign goods would become cheap and American exports expensive, creating trade deficits that drain gold reserves through the back door as trading partners demand metal for their surplus dollars. The exact dynamic that killed Bretton Woods when European central banks traded their dollar surpluses for American gold throughout the 1960s. Finding the Goldilocks rate requires not just mathematical precision, but also psychological insight into how markets will react, how much speculative pressure the system can withstand, and how quickly confidence can be built that this time, unlike past attempts, the commitment to gold will hold firm against political pressure to inflate during the inevitable next recession. Add to this the problem of partial convertibility, perhaps allowing only foreign central banks to redeem while preventing ordinary citizens from depleting reserves, which would create a two-tier system breeding resentment and undermining the populist appeal that makes the gold standard politically viable in the first place. Trump's team would need to navigate these contradictions while maintaining the appearance of simplicity and strength that characterizes his political brand, translating complex monetary architecture into messages about American greatness and renewed prosperity that resonate with voters who may not understand the mechanics, but sense that something fundamental has been broken in how money works. The pathway to implementation reveals why any such plan would likely remain secret until the last possible moment, when commitments are irrevocable and markets have no time to front-run the transition. Imagine the scenario. Trump wins re-election in 2024 and spends his early months rebuilding key alliances, stabilizing any immediate crises, and quietly positioning loyalists in crucial positions at Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and regulatory agencies that would need to coordinate the reset. Throughout 2025 and early 2026, behind closed doors, technical teams conduct the gold audit, assess international gold market capacity, and model various conversion scenarios using supercomputers and game theory to anticipate how Russia, China, Europe, and financial markets might respond to different announcement frameworks. Simultaneously, diplomatic backchannels work to secure agreements with key allies and even strategic rivals, offering them favorable terms or side deals in exchange for not sabotaging the transition, perhaps guaranteeing Europe continued access to dollar liquidity through special swap lines, or promising China priority in purchasing American goods with their dollar reserves before conversion. Legal teams prepare the executive orders, legislation, and regulatory frameworks needed to implement the new system, navigating constitutional questions about whether a president can unilaterally change monetary standards or whether congressional approval is required. A question with murky precedent given that Nixon closed the gold window by executive action, but establishing a new peg might require legislative authorization. By late 2026, with pieces in place, Trump faces the moment of truth. Announce the plan in a primetime address, perhaps timed to a moment of currency crisis elsewhere that validates his warnings about fiat money, framing the gold standard restoration as a rescue mission for American savers and a challenge to corrupt global elites who have debased currency for their own enrichment. The announcement would trigger immediate chaos as markets process the implications. Gold prices potentially doubling or tripling within hours, currency traders scrambling to adjust positions, and economists on television debating whether this represents visionary statesmanship or catastrophic folly. In the following weeks, the administration would need to manage the turbulence with a combination of market interventions, clear communication about implementation timelines, and visible demonstrations that the gold exists and the commitment is real, possibly including televised tours of Fort Knox or international audits by neutral parties. Success would depend on threading an impossibly narrow needle where confidence builds faster than panic spreads, where technical glitches get resolved before cascading into systemic breakdowns, and where political opposition gets overwhelmed by public support mobilized through Trump's media apparatus and allied commentators who frame the reset as a historic reclaiming of American sovereignty and economic security. Ordinary people would experience this transformation through a kaleidoscope of disorienting changes that reach into every corner of economic life. Consider Sarah, a small business owner in Tennessee, who took out loans to expand her bakery, suddenly finding that the interest rates on her variable rate credit lines spike because banks, uncertain how to price risk in the new monetary regime, retreat to conservative lending standards that favor only the most credit-worthy borrowers. Her suppliers, many importing ingredients from abroad, face their own turmoil as international payment systems recalibrate, and some foreign vendors refuse dollars until the conversion settles, forcing her to scramble for alternative sources or accept higher prices that squeeze her already thin margins. Meanwhile, her customers, reading headlines about currency instability and gold shortages, might either panic buy baked goods as a hedge against food price inflation or cut back on discretionary spending as general economic anxiety spreads, leaving Sarah caught between contradictory signals about whether to expand or contract her operations. Across town, Michael, a retired teacher living on a fixed pension, watches his purchasing power become a political football. If the gold standard succeeds in ending inflation, his pension checks might actually buy more each year, a reversal of the slow erosion he's endured for decades. But if the transition sparks deflation, prices might fall, but so too might economic activity, potentially threatening the state budget that funds his pension and triggering cuts that wipe out any gains from currency stability. His grandson, a recent college graduate with $40,000 in student loans, faces perhaps the starkest impact. That debt, fixed in nominal dollar terms, becomes a heavier burden in real terms if the gold-backed dollar appreciates, turning what seemed like manageable payments into a crushing load that might force him to delay buying a home, starting a family, or taking career risks, effectively transferring wealth from his generation to the creditors who hold his loans. These individual stories, multiplied across millions of households, would create complex political dynamics where the same policy generates passionate supporters and bitter opponents depending on their specific economic position, making it difficult to sustain the consensus needed to weather the transition's inevitable rough patches. The global chess game would unfold with moves and countermoves that test every assumption about power, cooperation, and the future of money itself. If Trump's gold standard gains traction, China might accelerate its own plans for a gold-backed digital yuan, leveraging its position as the world's largest gold producer and a major holder of gold reserves to offer developing nations an alternative to dollar dependence, particularly in Asia and Africa, where Belt and Road investments have already created yuan-denominated financial networks. This could split the global economy into competing monetary blocs, reminiscent of the Cold War, but with gold as the new ideological battleground, where American and Chinese systems vie for adherence based on who can maintain convertibility longer and offer more attractive terms for international trade. Oil-producing nations in the Middle East, long bound to dollar-denominated contracts, would face pressure from all sides. America demanding they maintain dollar pricing to preserve the petrodollar system that supports US fiscal dominance. China offering gold or yuan as alternatives that reduce their vulnerability to American sanctions and their own domestic considerations about which currency best preserves their wealth for future generations when oil runs out. Some might split the difference, pricing oil in a basket of currencies including gold-backed dollars and yuan, creating a hybrid system that no single power dominates but that introduces new complexities and frictions into energy markets that transmit unpredictably into gasoline prices in Los Angeles, heating costs in Berlin, and industrial production in Mumbai. Meanwhile, countries without significant gold reserves, much of Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, would find themselves at the mercy of the gold-rich powers, potentially forced to accumulate gold at inflated prices just to participate in international trade, recreating the core periphery dynamics that characterized the original gold standard era when European empires controlled both gold supplies and the rules of global commerce. The resulting tensions could fuel both cooperation, as nations with shared interests band together to negotiate better terms, and conflict, as resource competition intensifies and economic disruptions strain diplomatic relationships already tested by climate change, migration, and technological disruption. Ultimately, whether or not Trump or any American president actually restores the gold standard, the fact that such ideas have returned to public debate signals a deeper crisis of confidence in modern monetary policy and the institutions that have managed the post-1971 fiat system. The fascination with gold, ancient and immutable, persists even as technology and global finance evolve at breakneck speed, perhaps because gold represents a tangible anchor in an age of abstraction where wealth exists as digital entries, where central banks manufacture trillions with mouse clicks, and where the line between money and credit has blurred beyond recognition. For some, the gold standard offers a return to simplicity and discipline, a way to force governments to live within their means and preserve the value of honest work against the erosion of inflation. For others, it represents a dangerous nostalgia that ignores the lessons of history, when gold standard rigidity turned recessions into depressions, and when international gold flows created devastating boom-bust cycles that inflicted mass unemployment and social upheaval. As calls for a monetary reset grow louder, fueled by debt concerns, inequality debates, and dissatisfaction with central banks that seem to serve financial elites more than ordinary citizens, the allure of the gold standard, however challenging or even impossible in practice, remains a powerful force shaping both policy dreams and market expectations as the world heads toward 2027. The real question may not be whether Trump can restore the gold standard, but whether the current system can adapt and reform sufficiently to address the legitimate grievances that make such radical alternatives attractive, or whether we're destined for a period of monetary experimentation where nations try competing models and learn through trial, error, and potentially painful disruptions which approaches to money best serve human flourishing in an interconnected, rapidly changing world where old certainties no longer hold and new arrangements have yet to prove themselves.